Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jeremy Goodwin. Today marks 75 years since D-Day. That's, of course, the Allied invasion of northern France during World War II. It was a key turning point in the war at a time when Hitler was still in control of most of Europe. Joining me by phone from Normandy is John McManus. He's a professor of history at Missouri S&T in Rolla, Missouri, and among other books, the author of The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, The Big Red One at Omaha Beach. John McManus, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks. Good to be with you.
So tell me where you are right now and what brought you overseas.
Well, right now I am in Cherbourg. I'm aboard a cruise ship with the National World War II Museum. They put together a 75th anniversary tour for the Normandy invasion. And so what we've been doing, we've been sailing up and down the French coast the last 8 days or so. And so we've had, excursions to the various battlefields in the course of the last week. And so we are docked in Cherbourg today, and we'll head to the Normandy American Cemetery for the binational ceremonies commemorating the invasion.
So that will be a ceremony right over the beach commemorating the 75th anniversary?
Correct. Yeah, the cemetery is located on the bluffs overlooking what was really one of the bloodiest beaches that the Allies had in Normandy. It's a sector of Omaha Beach called Easy Red. And the cemetery has been placed there, and there are 9,388 Americans buried in that cemetery. And so you can imagine it's a very moving and poignant place.
And you've walked to the beach at Normandy in the past, right?
Oh, most definitely, quite a bit, yeah. Because I've done 3 books that have a Normandy theme. I did a series called The Americans at D-Day and The Americans at Normandy, and then, as you had mentioned, my most recent one was a book about the 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach. So in the course of researching those books, I've spent a lot of time here, actually, and sort of going through the battlefields and getting a sense of what the terrain is like, and also a sense, I suppose, about how the battle has reverberated here all these decades later, and boy, it really does.
Oh, so interesting. Well, as a military historian, I imagine you spend a lot of time working with documents, maybe in and out of libraries. What does it do for you to actually be there and be able to look around at the terrain and get a sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, because a lot of the great source material is, archival, documentary kind of material. To be here sort of immersed in this culture, and to get a look at the terrain, to get to walk in the footsteps of the soldiers, to see how the local towns or beaches have been affected, and what's left over from the war, such as German bunkers and barbed wire, things like that. Really does give you a nice flavor for this. I think it kind of rounds out the historical material, and also the many discussions and interviews I've done with veterans over the years. It's nice to be able to have that base point where I've been to these places too.
So there are things like German bunkers and barbed wire that have been left in place?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I mean, you'll see that all over Normandy, and so for instance, at Omaha Beach, some of the strongest of the German defenses were bunkers overlooking key exits from the beach, and by and large, most of those bunkers are still there. So they're really not all that different than they would have looked on D-Day, though the beach itself is different because there's a parking lot down where some of the landings took place that wasn't there on D-Day. There's the foliage is heavier and whatever, but still, you're seeing the landscape permanently altered. You'll see, like at Omaha Beach, for instance, which is a kind of a vacation area for many French today. You'll see a nice vacation cottage, and then right next to it is an old bunker, an old pillbox, something like that. So it's sort of like the modern with the old mixed together.
Is it a tourist location for World War II buffs?
It's a tourist location for many French, many Parisians in particular like to vacation on the Normandy coast, or just go for the weekends in the summertime. It's a really nice place to be. It's a wonderful wonderful lifestyle here and culture. But it also, I think, for Americans to come here is always a pretty nice experience, and you can really immerse yourself in the history. And of course, I mean, untold thousands upon thousands of American veterans have come back here to retrace their footsteps
Sure.
and get a sense of where they were and maybe even, face some of the demons of the past too, because this was a ferocious battle fought here.
Yeah. Well, you wrote about that battle. You have several times. One of those times you dissected the storming of the beach. There was the book "The Dead and Those About to Die" about D-Day, and the military unit known as the Big Red One. What's the Big Red One?
Yeah, that refers to the 1st Infantry Division, which has been in existence for just over 100 years. So it fought in World War I and established that nickname for itself, the Big Red One, and they have a red one on their patch. And by World War II, they're a kind of a go-to unit to win battles for you when you really need that. And they had invaded North Africa, Sicily, and then they get the key assignment at Omaha Beach. And, of course, after that, fought all the way through to Germany and suffered, you can imagine, a lot of casualties. So they had this kind of unique persona and pride. They were, a heavy, experienced combat unit who could sometimes be a handful while off the line, disciplinary-wise. So they were not people to be messed with, but they were the exact kind of people you wanted for this tremendous challenge of taking this beach and also then subsequently fighting in Normandy, where really, D-Day happens June 6th, but the Battle of Normandy lasts another 2 months, and the fighting is just a meat grinder kind of ferocity. And so the Big Red One is sort of one of the key American units that helps the Allies win.
Yeah, I imagine you get this a lot, John, but I'm going to ask you about Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of us have seen that film and the riveting opening scene that depicts very vividly the attack that morning. Is that how it went?
To some extent it is. Of course, it's a film, so some things are not quite, exactly accurate. For instance, the soldiers are very close together, and they would have tried to spread out. But you have to do that cinematically. You've got to have the people in the scene. They've got the log obstacles that you see are pointing in the wrong direction. On D-Day, they were in the opposite direction. So, there are things like that historians like me, who, by the way, are no fun to watch these kind of movies with because we pick at everything, So there are things like that.
But aside from, some details that the expert notices, you think it portrayed the tenor of that assault?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I just think it portrayed in particular the violence. And I think they didn't shrink from that. I'm glad they didn't. I think that's the way war films should be done if they're covering combat. And of course, you could also, we can look at incidents from that film, and we can find corroborating circumstances that actually did happen that inspired what they showed in the film. And so, yeah, I think it's a really good representation, and I actually use it in my classes. I have for going on 20 years now. So I'm glad that film got made.
The impression I get from Saving Private Ryan and some other films about World War II is that the assault on Normandy was really a matter of throwing numbers at the Germans, that the Allies were prepared to go in and take heavy casualties in service of eventually overwhelming the enemy. Was it more complicated than that?
It is more complicated, but I think there's a major element of truth in that. Of course, the Allies do have that advantage of numbers at the scene of the invasion. What you don't see in that film and in the other sources is that, of course, the Germans nonetheless control much of the continent. So if they know the time and place of the invasion, they can throw a lot of people at that problem. So the fact that the Allies are going to have more numbers may not actually be true if you're looking at the bigger picture. And of course, if they're just landing on a few beaches, their combat strength and numbers may be funneled and maybe fatally if the Germans can counterattack well enough. So really, in some respects, beyond the valor of the average ground combat soldier, which I think really is what wins any war, and particularly this one, nonetheless, the Allies have control of the air and the sea. They have very strong air and sea power, and that's kind of the key to them getting back on the continent. And it's something the Germans can't quite match. But at the same time, that doesn't prevent it just being a bloodbath on the ground in Normandy and afterwards.
Yeah, and you mentioned getting a beachhead on the continent. What was the strategic importance of this battle at the moment that it happened?
Yeah, this is going to create what the planners had called a second front. The Soviets and the Eastern Front have been doing the vast majority of the fighting and dying for the Allies. Now, the Allies had a massive aerial campaign to try and bring Germany to its knees and cripple its air force. They had fought in the Mediterranean, most notably in Italy. The invasion of Normandy really is going to be the beginning of the end for Hitler. I think of it always as a pivot point. Once the Germans lose in Normandy, and sort of the success of the Normandy invasion is an indicator that that's possibly going to happen. Once they lose in Normandy, they're probably going to lose the war. But to get ashore requires just a prodigious planning effort, and of course, as I mentioned, the air and the sea power, winning control of the air and sea, and it's a technological problem in the sense of how are you going to communicate? How are you going to resupply? Where are you going to move people? For every soldier you land on the continent, you got to supply them. All these kind of factors come into play.
John
McManus, really quite a complicated thing.
Yeah, John, we have to take a quick break right now, so we're going to do that. But we will be back shortly to continue the conversation. This is This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. My guest is Missouri S&T Professor of History John McManus. He's currently in Europe to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day. More precisely, he's actually in Normandy for the 75th anniversary of that turning point in the war. John, did the invasion of Normandy go as planned?
Oh, no, definitely not. So many things went wrong. I mean, of course, overall it succeeds, so yes, great, but at the same time, there were so many things that went wrong. I'll just give you one example looking at Omaha Beach. The pre-invasion bombardment by both the Air Force and the Navy is next to useless, and mainly because the bombers are being asked to bomb on a very tight window, about 1,000-yard window, and they just don't have that kind of accuracy. They're bombing through heavy cloud cover, and of course they don't want to bomb their own fleet and their own people, so they wait several extra moments, and most of their bombs fall inland and don't do any damage. The naval bombardment lasts 45 minutes, and the reason for that is so that you'll have the element of surprise against the Germans, which of course is crucial. It just wasn't enough time to do any damage. Then
something that really opened my eyes, John, in your book was the idea that when those crafts landed just offshore, they were expecting to find a beach that had already been prepared, right? Yeah,
well, and that's what they've been told. Now, many of the veterans who had fought in previous battles and knew that things went wrong, they had been skeptical, and they just kind of chuckled ruefully to themselves if they thought of it all. And said, "Yeah, well, we'll do what we always have to do, which is fight this battle on the ground and win it that way." And and of course, the whole plan was predicated on putting all sorts of people and tanks and specialists together at the same time to present the Germans with overwhelming targets. And in fact, what happens is it gets confused and people get behind. They land late. They land in the wrong spot, and so they land piecemeal, and the Germans can focus on one group at a time and exact tremendous damage among them. So, the plan really unraveled pretty quickly there. And the airborne is another example. The paratroopers are just scattered all over the place and then have to kind of improvise. So, the Normandy invasion is anything but a fine-tuned operation. As great as the planning was, it's an improvisation kind of thing.
And in fairness, it's of course the largest amphibious assault in human history. Is that the case?
It probably is. Now, the invasion of Okinawa was a pretty massive effort too, and it's later in the war. And of course, another invasion of the Philippines before that was pretty huge as well. So you'll sometimes hear quibbles here and there about the size of it, but there's no doubt that you could make an argument Normandy is the most important invasion ever. And you're landing 156,000 soldiers that's a huge operation, of course.
And some of the details that you uncover are so vivid. Just the idea that the wind was strong that morning, and folks weren't necessarily planned for that, and that people were packed down with more equipment than they necessarily needed. That was making it hard to swim.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, they're weighted down with way too much stuff. They're seasick, they're woozy, they're frightened. And I mean, you could just imagine you're dumped into the water on the sand, and you're disoriented, and you're hauling around 70 to 80 pounds of stuff at least. It's just way too much, and it makes you a better target then. It's a kind of an American tendency to do this, to weigh down our combat soldiers with way too much stuff. And the invasion of Normandy is really a prime example of that. The airborne troopers, in many cases, are hauling so much that they have to be helped aboard the planes before they leave England. So you can imagine jumping into the night with this stuff on you, and how heavy that's going to be when you land. And again, how disorienting, how difficult that would be.
And you write that the failure to dislodge the German forces from the beach with that air power ahead of time, you see as symptomatic of some recurring mistakes that the U.S. military had been making at that point in its history?
Yeah, I think that there was an American tendency to over-rely on air power, certainly on technological power, but on air power, and to ask too much from what was a great thing. That, of course, it was great to have this remarkable aerial armada. There's about 11,000 plus planes available, and it's great to have that, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be a kind of magical elixir. And I just feel like you were asking the heavy bombers to do something at Omaha Beach they weren't really capable of. Whereas at the American beach at Utah, they had medium bombers that flew lower and were a little more accurate and did more damage. So that was a bit more successful. But I think that there was a tendency to have a bit too much confidence in what are otherwise great assets: air power, technological power, the intel that they gathered, all this kind of stuff. In the end, it really came down to the fighting ground soldier to make this thing work.
John, 75 years later, what do people misunderstand about D-Day these days?
Well, I think there's a tendency to feel that the war ended with D-Day, and it really didn't. It was from an American perspective, and from a kind of British and Canadian and French perspective, the worst of the fighting was just beginning. And in fact, there was almost a year of terrible fighting ahead in order to liberate Western Europe and defeat Nazi Germany. So I almost liken D-Day to opening day in baseball. I mean, it's great to win, but you got the whole season ahead. So D-Day just sort of presents the opportunities now the Allies had to defeat the German army in the field, and of course for the Soviets to do the same on the Eastern Front. So in that respect, I suppose it's the beginning and the end. But boy, it's a long way between beginning and end there.
What was the reaction of the American public at the time?
It was, D-Day was an enormously heavily anticipated event. There were people who had, in fact, this is very common. How like nowadays when we have March Madness, you have your pool and you speculate on who's going to win and all that. Well, people had those kind of betting pools in relation to when the invasion would happen. They would guess the time and even the place in some cases. And so, I mean, the entire Western world, but particularly the USA, was waiting with bated breath. And so when it happened, there was a lot of confusion because there had been a false report a few days before that the invasion had started. And so when you get the fragmentary reports on the U.S. side of the Atlantic on June 6th, you're a little skeptical at first if you're the average citizen. But once they figured out that this was real, it was the kind of thing where you remembered where you were and what you were doing. You will remember that for the rest of your life, just like you would with Pearl Harbor or the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, that kind of world-altering event. President Roosevelt led the country in prayer. That's exceptionally rare for an American president to do. And schools closed, businesses closed, people went to church. Churches were mobbed with people. So it was something that for the people who experienced it, they really never forgot.
And of course, it has a huge role in our collective cultural memory today. But was this the sort of battle that military historians still sift through and pick apart and analyze after the fact?
Oh, absolutely. Military historians are still kicking this one around on so many different levels. In fact, next month, I'm going to be going to England to University of Portsmouth, and we're going to have a Normandy 75 conference, which encompasses, of course, D-Day, but beyond that, the whole Battle of Normandy. And I can tell you, from a sort of scholarly point of view, it's still a very rich field in which, believe it or not, there's still all kinds of new information that comes out, or at least new interpretations. And I'm pretty confident that I think the historians are going to be mulling this one over for a long time to come, because the importance is certainly just indisputable. And I think there's a level of historical fascination with it that just has never quite gone away.
What other battles might you compare it to, whether talking about the tactics or just the importance, the relative importance?
Well, in terms of the tactics, we could compare it with, many amphibious invasions that the Americans launch in the course of the war. And, of course, the German reaction, too, is interesting compared with other amphibious invasions. What I mean by that, the famous Field Marshal Rommel feels that the division has to be defeated at the landing line, so he invests a lot of resources to do that, and it's quite a failure. Whereas the Japanese, at that same moment, were starting to reorient to what's called an inland defense. They thought, well, the Americans are going to get ashore as long as they have a better control of the air and the sea against us. So why don't we just fortify inland and bleed them? And you see that at places like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Philippines, so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of interesting comparisons in that respect. As far as importance of a battle, D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, I know of no more important battle in World War II. There's just no question about that.
John, why military history for you? How did you get into this?
Well, I think personally there's nothing more that any of us could ever be asked to do than to put our lives on the line. And also, when I look at human history, there's an undeniable pattern that war seems to happen all the time, and it seems to drive so much of human history. And I think that's terribly tragic and unfortunate. And just as I think it's important for physicians to study disease, I think it's important for historians to study warfare in the hopes of perhaps learning some lessons. And I also think it ought to be remembered and understood of those who actually fight wars, what that really means, why they do it. That's part of what animates my whole career is getting to that idea of combat motivation. Not what motivates you to sign up, but what motivates you to actually fight. It's two very different things. So I just feel as though those are important questions in the abstract, but also as an American military historian, I'm very interested in Americans and what makes them tick. And I think that by studying the military side and Americans in military conflict, I think we find out a lot about ourselves.
And I imagine you've talked to a lot of veterans of World War II.
Well, absolutely. I've been at this for about 20 some odd years, interviewing veterans. Unfortunately, we don't have very many left from World War II anymore, which is a very sad thing. But on the fortunate side, not just me, but many, many other historians have done a heck of a lot of work to discuss these things with veterans and preserve their stories, foster oral histories, memoirs, diaries, letters, things like that, primary sources that'll be with us forever. And so, yeah, and I've gotten, quite a feel for what that generation experienced just from knowing so many of these folks.
Yeah.
And I just think that's important to remember.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll be a very moving experience today for that anniversary, the 75th anniversary of D-Day. You're on the spot in Normandy, France. That's our time right now, John, but thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my guest here has been Missouri S&T Professor of History John McManus. He is currently overseas to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.